Ivanhoe, a Romance by Sir Walter Scott. (1900). Introduction. Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott, one of the four great novelists of the 19th century, was born in Edinburgh, August 15th, 1771. His parents were not rich, nor did they have titles of nobility. They were simply respectable, quote, gentlefolk, unquote. His mother, a good, intelligent woman, was the daughter of a professor of medicine at Edinburgh University. His father was a lawyer. Going back of this plain parentage, we find a long line of Scots, whom one writer speaks of as a, quote, great riding and sporting and fighting clan, end quote, border country people whose names appear in many a wild tale dealing with raid and foray. Had Sir Walter lived a century earlier, possibly he would have been a chieftain, ever foremost in midnight excursions across the border. His boyhood days brought him, in a way, quite close to these rough ancestors. Although a sturdy child, he was lame from babyhood. It was thought that outdoor life might cure this. So the first 8 years of his life were spent, for the most part, at the home of his grandfather, a sheep farmer who lived not many miles from where, years after, Abbotsford was built. Here his chief pleasure was to listen to stories told him by the shepherds and by his grandfather, border tales and ballads, many of them family traditions. He soon knew them by heart. When he returned to Edinburgh to attend the high school, he was in excellent health, though his lameness was never cured. He was not a remarkable scholar, though he excelled in history and composition. But he was a lively fellow, popular with his mates, and a master hand at storytelling. He read many books, particularly histories, and such as contained ballads and legends. Froissart's Chronicles and Percy's Relics of Ancient Poetry were favorites. It was much the same at the University of Edinburgh, which he attended later. In after years, he often expressed regret that he had done so much reading and had not studied more systematically. Scott's father wanted his son to be a lawyer, so when about 15, and while attending classes at the university, Walter began the customary 5 years apprenticeship, after which came 3 years of hard law study. He was admitted to the bar when 21. These days of apprenticeship and study were not without their pleasures. First of all was his reading. Whatever had to do with the early history of Scotland delighted him. He learned Spanish and Italian that he might read the romances of Cervantes and Ariosto. Whatever he read, he remembered. Besides poring over books, he found pleasure in his, quote, raids, end quote, as he called them, excursions to the highlands or to the border country, visits to old battlefields, and to places of romantic interest. His, quote, raids, end quote, in Liddesdale, made with boon companions of his own age, were not always as quiet and orderly as might be. We may think of him, too, as cutting a figure as a popular young man about town. This manner of life was an excellent preparation for story writing, but did not make Scott a great lawyer. He never liked the profession. Still, he practiced more or less for 14 years, though it brought him but little money, and for years after that he served as Clerk of Sessions, an office in connection with the Court of Edinburgh. But little by little, he drifted away toward the high seas of literature. Scott's career as a writer began when he was 25. It falls naturally into 2 periods of 18 years each, the first devoted principally to poetry, the second principally to prose fiction. His first venture was a translation of 2 German poems. His second was a work in several volumes called Border Minstrelsy. This contained a few original poems, but was for the most part merely a collection of old Scotch ballads, which he had been gathering ever since he was a boy. It was patterned after Percy's Relics of Ancient Poetry. This venture was a great success, the books selling rapidly, and the young Scotchman, so nearly a failure as a lawyer, became widely known. That was the simple beginning. But the, quote, lawyer-poet, end quote, was destined to be more than a mere translator, more than an enthusiastic collector of half-forgotten ballads. He was to write poems of his own and become the most popular poet of his day. We can do no more in this brief sketch than give the titles of the three of his best-known poems: The Lay of the Last Minstrel, Marmion, and The Lady of the Lake. Critics agree that these are not great poems, and even young readers see that in some respects they are carelessly written. But the world has read them with pleasure. Even today, though they are nearly a century old, they please hundreds and thousands of readers. And the reason is not far to seek. They are spirited narratives, dealing with the Scotland of long ago. They were written by one who was thoroughly in love with his theme, and composed with a fiery enthusiasm that is irresistible. How did it come about that so successful a poet turned novelist? There were many reasons, but two are more important than the others. In the first place, Scott's field was a narrow one. Interesting as it was, the public could not be expected to be satisfied with it forever. In the second place, Lord Byron, a great English poet of quite a different kind, had sprung into prominence. Perhaps there was room for both, but Scott doubted it, and felt that he must try some new form of literature, or else be forgotten. And so it happened that in 1814, Scott being then 43, there appeared anonymously a novel entitled Waverley, a story which had been written 10 years before and cast aside as worthless. It was published as a forlorn hope, yet it was the most successful novel ever written up to that time. The sales were enormous. Quote, "The Great Unknown," end quote, as Scott was called, was the talk of the day among reading people. Other novels appeared with amazing rapidity. Guy Mannering, The Antiquary, Old Morality, all, quote, by the author of Waverley, end quote. Not till 1827 was the author's name generally known, though many had guessed it long before. In all, there are 29 Waverley novels, a noble collection of historical romances, the most brilliant in all literary history. At one extreme is St. Ronan's Well, a tale of 1800. At the other is Count Robert of Paris, the scene of which is laid in Byzantium, the year 1090. In Scotland, England, or on the continent, quote, the wizard, end quote, seemed equally at home. We may pardon him if in covering so much ground he fell frequently into minor inaccuracies. A good romancer is rarely a good historian. The first 9 novels dealt entirely with Scotland. Ivanhoe, published in late 1819, was the 10th of the series, and the first that dealt with English history. It was a question in Scott's mind whether he could, with success, pass from Scottish manners and history, with which he was so familiar, to English history, an untried field. But just as Waverley outstripped all novels that had appeared up to that time, so Ivanhoe outstripped the other Waverley novels and is today perhaps the favorite. In reading it, 2 things should be kept in mind. First, it was written when Scott was at the pinnacle of fame. He was a newly made baronet. He had declined the laureateship of England. The reading world was at his feet. In the second place, it was written when Scott was in poor health, hardly expecting to live to see the romance completed. Much of it was dictated by the author when he was unable to sit up, paroxysms of pain frequently interrupting the work. Besides the romantic poems and the Waverley novels, Scott wrote a life of Napoleon in 9 volumes, edited the works of Dryden and Swift, and turned out many essays, reviews, and tales of minor importance. Such unprecedented industry becomes the more wonderful when we learn that the writing of books was but a small part of Scott's life. To explain this, we must go back again to Scott, the young man. When 28, he was appointed Sheriff of Selkirkshire, a life position with an annual salary of £300. Eventually, his clerkship at the Court of Sessions yielded him an income of £1,500 a year. He had a small fortune of his own. His books brought phenomenal returns. What did he do with his rapidly increasing fortune? From early manhood, his fondest dream had been to become a great landowner and live in grand baronial style, entertaining with old-time, open-handed hospitality all his friends. He wished to do, quote, the honors for all Scotland, end quote. He wished to be, quote, the founder of a race of Scottish lairds, end quote. In time, this dream was realized, and all the world knows of Abbotsford on the River Tweed. But this could not be accomplished in a day. First, there was a little home at Laswad, near Edinburgh, to which at 27 he brought his bride, Charlotte Carpenter, daughter of a French royalist. A few years later, his income warranting the change, he moved to Ashestill on the Tweed near Yarrow, where he lived 8 years. It was here that the Lay of the Last Minstrel was completed. Mr. Collier gives this delightful picture of his manner of life in early days. Quote, rising at 5, he lit his own fire, if it was cold weather, dressed with care, and went out to see his favorite horse. At 6, he was seated at his desk, and in his shooting jacket, or other out-of-doors garb, with a dog or two couched at his feet, there he wrote till breakfast time, at 9 or 10, and then by that hour he had, in his own words, quote, broken the neck of the day, end quote. A couple of hours after breakfast were also given to the pen, and at 12 he was, quote, his own man, end quote, free for the day. By 1 he was on horseback with his greyhounds, led by his side, ready for some hours' coursing, or he was gliding in a boat over some deep pool on the Tweed, salmon spear in hand, watching in the sunlight for a silver-scaled 20-pounder. Such sport, varied with breezy rides by green glen and purple moorland, closed the day, whose early hours had been given to the battle of Flodden, or the romantic wanderings of Fitzjames, end quote. In 1812, 2 years before Waverley was published, he purchased the first of many farms which eventually were comprised by the estate of Abbotsford. The building of its great home is a story too well known to need repeating. Everything was on a grand scale, no expense being spared. Apparently every wish was gratified. For many years, the great-hearted novelist lived here with his family and friends, writing industriously, personally superintending every improvement, a busy, happy man. Then came a reverse, which would have crushed any ordinary mortal. In 1826, the publishing house which had issued the poems and the Waverley novels, a concern in which he was a silent partner, failed, and Scott found himself, at 55, a bankrupt, owing over £120,000. And now the true spirit of this, quote, wizard of the North, end quote, shone forth. Every offer of aid was promptly rejected. He made it a point of honor to pay every penny. To do this, he redoubled his energy, turning out novels with unprecedented rapidity, and rarely did his spirits lag. But so intense a strain could not long be endured. His health, which had been none too good for many years, rapidly declined. A 6 months' residence in Italy failed to do him any good. His great task all but accomplished, he died at Abbotsford, September 21st, 1832. His body rests amid the ruins at Dryburgh Abbey, not many miles down the Tweed from his famous home. The characteristics of Scott, the man, and the author were apparent. We have seen that he was a hard worker and an equally hard player, that he had a fearless, open, winning nature, that he loved the past that rings with tilt and tourney, and that very dear to him was his native Scotland. The careful reader will have no difficulty in adding to this list of characteristics. A parting word of caution, however, may not be amiss. Scott was a great and good man, an author whom we may safely make a life companion, but he was not perfect. The spirit of his entire life tells us that the great man would prefer that we do not put him on a cold pedestal for blind worship, but rather treat him as a fellow creature, human, like ourselves. The standard bibliography of Scott is by his son-in-law, Mr. Lockhart. A good short biography is that by Richard H. Hutton. Thank you for joining me. Like and subscribe. For next week, we start Ivanhoe.